And welcome to the 20th meeting of the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee. The meeting will be conducted in a hybrid format with one member, Stuart Stevenson, participating remotely. Apologies have been received from Peter Chapman and also Richard Lyle, and I'd like to welcome Graham Simpson and Christine Graham, who are attending as their respective substitutes. I'd like to turn to agenda item 1, which is a declaration of interest. We have a new committee member, Oliver Mundell. Now, the committee met last night in private, but this is the first chance for Oliver to declare any interests that he has publicly. Can I ask you, Oliver, do you have any interests that you wish to declare?
I have no interest to declare, Convener.
Thank you very much. So we'll move on to agenda item 2. The committee today is taking evidence from the Cabinet Secretary on transport matters. And I'd like to welcome the panel from the Scottish Government. First of all, Michael Matheson, the Cabinet Secretary for Transport, Infrastructure and Connectivity. Bill Reeve, the Director of Rail. And Alison Irvine, the Director of Strategy and Analysis for Transport Scotland. Before we turn to this item, can I ask if any members have any interests they wish to declare? No. I'm just looking. Stuart seems to. I can't see Mr. Stevenson, which is a pity. I can see you now, Mr. Stevenson. Do you have an interest you wish to declare?
Yes, I'm obliged, Convener. I just draw attention to the fact that I am the Honorary President of the Scottish Association for Public Transport and the Honorary Vice President of Rail Future UK, and these are both subjects that we'll be covering today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Now, Cabinet Secretary, I can just about see you in the gloom back there, but I'd like to invite you, if I may, to make a short opening statement, Cabinet Secretary, of up to 3 minutes. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to start by sharing my condolences with the family and friends of Donald Dinny, Brett McCulloch, Christopher Suchbury, and all affected by the tragic incident at Stonehaven. I would also like to thank the emergency services and railway staff for their dedication and professionalism in dealing with the tragedy. By way of an update, the Rail Accident Investigation Branch, the independent railway accident investigation body, has an investigation underway. The RAIB's remit is to conduct a no-blame investigation into railway incidents in order to determine the cause or causes, ensure lessons are learned, make recommendations to improve safety and to restore the site of the accident to service. The RAIB will generally publish findings within 6 to 12 months. However, an interim report may be published before that. Parallel to the investigations being undertaken by the RAIB, Police Scotland and British Transport Police are investigating the circumstances of the incident with the Railway Inspectorate. These investigations are under the direction of the Lord Advocate, who will conclude whether there is a case for criminal prosecution or if the incident will be subject to a fatal accident inquiry. Moving now to our ongoing response to the COVID pandemic, the Transport Transition Plan, launched on the 26th of May, continues to evolve. As we move through phase 3 of the route map, we continue to monitor travel demand, and while there have been some localised issues, we have not seen on any substantial scale demand for public transport outstripped by available capacity. We will continue to engage closely with public transport operators, regional transport partnerships and the local authorities in Glasgow and Edinburgh City region to ensure our respective plans are aligned. We want to lock in the benefits of some of the behaviours throughout lockdown. For example, 65% of people surveyed say that they will walk and cycle more in the future, demonstrating why the £39 million Spaces for People Fund has been so important. And in keeping with public transport services running while capacity is at a reduced level, we have committed some £487 million in additional financial support for public transport services in Scotland. The largest bus operators are running, on average, almost 95% of normal services, with ScotRail running at 91% of normal service level. Several local authorities have also submitted bids to the £10 million Bus Priority Rapid Deployment Fund to maximise the efficiency of bus travel as traffic levels increase. And finally, our travel demand messaging with associated marketing and outreach continues to ensure that those who need to travel can do so safely. I'll end my remarks there, Convener, and I'm happy to respond to any questions from committee members.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary, for that. And the committee have already said how sorry they were to hear of the accident at the last meeting, but I'm sure we'd echo exactly what you have just said. And the first question will come from the Deputy Convener, Maureen Watt. Maureen.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary and panel. Yes, my question does focus on the very tragic accident at Carmont. You gave us a bit of an update on the investigations that are ongoing, but can you give us an idea of when the line may reopen for passengers from Aberdeen in the north-south?
Well, you'll appreciate the site is presently still under the control of Police Scotland while the investigation has been taken forward. The investigation that they're leading along with the British Transport Police is running in parallel with the Real Accident Investigation Branch's investigation. The challenge which they've experienced is access to the site. You appreciate it's a very difficult area for the engineers and for the investigators to access. At the present moment, significant work has been undertaken in order to provide an access road into the site, which is now at a very advanced stage. That will then, once that is being complete, and once the investigation has been complete, the Network Rail and the engineers will be in a position where they can start the recovery phase of the process. My expectation is that the line will remain closed for passenger use into October, given the scale of the challenge which they face in moving into the recovery phase once the investigation has been complete. So my expectation at this stage is that the line will remain closed into October.
Clearly, thank you for that. Clearly, one of the task forces is looking into earthworks and the, I suppose, increasing probability and possibility of landslides given the changing nature of our climate. If earthworks are identified and a huge amount of earthwork is required, will this be at the expense of improvements, other improvements in the pipeline for Network Rail and our rail infrastructure?
Well, you'll be aware that Network Rail have been undertaking an initial inspection of sites across the whole of the UK network. I've received a copy of their report and an opportunity to consider that. I think it'd be fair to say at this stage it's important we allow the investigation to be taken forward and to await the outcome of that and to see what learning comes from that. If that indicates that there is a need for a change in approach to the way in which earthworks and other works such as drainage works are managed by Network Rail, then clearly what will be important is to understand the nature of what that change will be and how that will then be taken forward. I'm not able to say at this present moment whether that will result in additional resources being needed for that or whether it will require us to change the profile of how resourcing is provided to Network Rail. What I can say though is that in our high-level specifications for Network Rail, climate change is one of the key areas that we asked them to address and to look at the impact that that will have on the network. and they've already started work in prior to the tragic incident in Stonehaven. They'd already started work in looking to address some of the challenges which they have with their infrastructure and in climate change. So there may be a need for some of that work to be accelerated. What I can say, though, is that going from Network Rail's initial report is that they've already changed some of their protocols for decision making during periods of adverse weather. I would probably categorise that as that they have implemented changes which would take a more cautious approach when periods of adverse weather take place. That's already been issued to staff, but clearly once we have the findings from the REIB report, we'll be in a better position to understand whether there's further work that needs to be undertaken.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen. I think Stuart Stevenson wants to come out with a brief follow-up before we go to the next questions. Stuart.
Thank you very much, Convener. It relates to the adverse weather that caused the problem south of Stonehaven. And I just wonder if the Cabinet Secretary has anything to say about the Edinburgh-Glasgow link and the breach of the Union Canal that has closed that bit of our railway network, and whether he can update us on what's happening both to the canal and to the railway.
So in relation to the Glasgow-Edinburgh line, the canal, the Union Canal, which breached and swept away almost a kilometre of the rail bed on the Glasgow-Edinburgh line, has been plugged. So the breach has been plugged. There is now extensive recovery work being undertaken. I can't give you an exact timescale at the present moment. I'll be in a better position tomorrow because I'm visiting the site tomorrow morning to see progress and to discuss the matter with engineers on the ground. But again, I expect it will be a number of weeks before that repair work is complete. It's not only swept away a kilometre of the actual rail bed, it is also swept away the electrical infrastructure. So the overhead lines, the foundations, etc. have all been swept away from the breach. It's very extensive, the level of damage that has been caused. But again, it will be a number of weeks before that is repaired. But I'll have a better idea tomorrow once I visit the site to see firsthand.
And Cabinet Secretary, it might be helpful if you could notify what you find tomorrow to the committee as a result of that question.
More than happy to do so.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Christine Graham. Christine.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, I note the drop-off in walking, and although there's been a slight increase in cycling, the figures for the 10th to the 16th of August this year demonstrate that walking trips are down 35%, and while cycling is up 30%, it's 30% from a very small base, and of course that's more than offset by the drop in walking. So while I welcome the People Fund to encourage active travel, you can't do it. For example, if you've got to negotiate the Sheriff Hall, you've got cycle routes on one side of it, cycle routes on the other, but then you've got the meat grinder, as cyclists call it. So, we need to link this up. So can you advise the progress and improvements to the Sheriff Hall roundabout, which, as I understand it, includes an underpass for walking and cycling, which would link up the cycle routes north and south?
Constituency question, but maybe not, Christine, because I want to get a question in the chamber at some stage. Cabinet Secretary.
Okay, specifically on Sheriff Hall, so the member may be aware that in December last year we published the draft orders, which is part of the statutory process. That process concluded on the 31st of January this year. Now, as part of the response to that consultation exercise, alongside discussions we've been having with the City Region Deal partners, we're undertaking a review of the Sheriff Hall roundabout proposal. The review is focusing on the feasibility and also the desirability to further improve the active travel measures that are presently planned for this development, and also the public transport provisions that are intended for the new Sheriff Hall roundabout, to see whether there is additional provision that could be provided in this proposal which could be taken forward but would not have an impact on local landowners, residents and businesses. The review of the active travel and the public transport provision has been run in parallel with the work that we'd undertaken to address the objections which have been received during the publication of the draft orders and the statutory process that goes with that. So the review will help to support us in identifying whether there are further measures that could be incorporated into the design to help to support better active travel provision and also public transport provision.
A quick supplementary. Can I ask you what you talk about improving active travel measures and public transport provision in ordinary speak? What does that mean?
So is there a way in which we could actually improve the cycling, walking provisions and also bus provisions that are planned for the network around the Sheriff Hall Roundabout? So it's looking to see whether we can improve on what was presently planned and doing so in a way that it doesn't impact on local landowners, businesses and local residents.
Okay. Colin, I think you've got some questions you'd like to ask. Colin.
Much. Convener, can I first of all associate myself entirely with the Cabinet Secretary and your own comments about the dreadful Stonehaven derailment. But can I turn to the issue of buses? There's obviously been a range of schemes announced recently to support the bus sector, the continued payment of the National Travel Scheme, COVID-19 excuse me, support scheme, I think about 110 million in total. And it's quite hard to follow because most of these, to be honest, have been announced through Twitter and press releases and not through parliamentary statements. But in Parliament last week, Cabinet Secretary, you did say that in return for this support, bus operators are required to provide specified levels of service approaching 100% pre-COVID levels. Now, I can't find the agreement anywhere that specifies that. So can you tell us, is that the clear requirement for these payments to the bus companies, and how is that being enforced?
Yeah, it is a clear requirement as part of the service agreement which we have with them as we manage this fund, and they need to be able to evidence that as well. So, so funding is dependent on them providing what would be the normal 100% or as close to the 100% services that they would have provided prior to COVID-19.
You monitoring that, because right across Scotland at the moment we're seeing local bus services being cut all over the place, and lots of services that were stopped during the lockdown not being reinstated. I can think of 2 or 3 in my own region straight away. So it's quite clear they haven't gone back to 100% service level. So how are you monitoring that, and will you publish that detail?
There's a difference between 100% of the routes and 100% capacity of what they can actually provide. So there will still be a process where local authorities, alongside that, for example, if a bus operator is looking to change an existing service, then they are also required to go through the normal process of consultation. So engaging with local authorities, local regional transport partnerships and also local public consultation. And then, of course, to go through the Traffic Commissioner route for any decisions if they are choosing to remove services. What they are also required to do is to respond to any local issues around capacity constraints that may be experienced that are flagged up to them by local authorities or health boards. And the reason for that provision is in order to try and make sure that where there are routes they may be experiencing capacity constraints on due to physical distancing, is that if that's been flagged up to them by the local authority or by the health board, that they look at providing additional capacity on these routes in order to try and address any issues around physical distancing and capacity constraints. So there may be instances where local bus operators may choose to increase the frequency of a service in order to meet these challenges around capacity constraints and increased levels of demand. So there is a process there which we check. This is taken forward on a non-profit basis. We're only meeting the gap that's left because of physical distancing. So we're not paying for all services as such. But it's a process that we go through in terms of reconciliation. Alison can maybe say a bit more about the process that we have in checking that against what bus operators are saying to us.
And so in terms of monitoring, just to add to what the Cabinet Secretary said, we've got regular dialogue with the bus operators and also with local authorities across the country, where we can respond to individual circumstances where services are being affected. The funding has been provided on the condition of as close to normal services based on kilometres run. There's also conditions associated with fare levels as well, associated with that. Information is put into the Travel Line Scotland app as well, so that there's a level of monitoring there available there in terms of service level provision across the constituent local authorities. So quite a complex picture, but quite a lot of regular monitoring and dialogue ongoing.
Just to be clear, because I'm confused, because the only thing that I've seen published by Transport Scotland in terms of conditions was the COVID-19 support grant, which said the grant terms require operators to continue to deliver around 30% or 25 to 35% in brackets of bus service levels for the period of the scheme to maintain core services. So that's been published. So I'm a bit confused by this 100%. So just to be clear, you're saying 100% of based on the number of kilometres that the buses travelled previously. How do you define 100%? It's not.
So I think the figures that you're talking about there, the 30 to 40%, that represents the first instalment of the COVID support grant. I think that has been updated as we've gone through the the transition plan, so that we're now looking for near normal levels of activity. But what I can do, Mr Smith, if that's useful, is just to take offline and direct you to the place where the conditions associated with the support funding for bus are available.
Can you answer the question just about when you say 100%, is that you said kilometres?
Near normal levels of kilometres run. And I think just to expand again and to reiterate what the Cabinet Secretary has said, we're responding to a very changing situation. We are working with the bus operators and they are responding positively where we are seeing service levels where capacity is being breached because of the requirement to physical distancing. There are changes being made to various services to support particular instances, and that activity is undertaken when dialogue between the operators, the local authorities, and depending on the individual circumstances involved. So, for example, when the schools returned last week, there was, or the week before rather, there was a series of dialogue around ensuring that there was public transport bus services available to support that. So it's quite an ongoing circumstance that we're dealing with here, and we are working with the capacity and as effectively as we possibly can.
Okay, there's a few members that got follow-up questions on buses. I'll come to Graham first, and then I'm going to come to Maureen. Graham.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to explore the issue raised by Colin Smith, because I'm equally as confused as Colin is on this. If we're saying that bus services have to be maintained at pre-COVID levels, then why are we getting bus companies cutting services, actually removing services in some cases, many cases actually, and with no consultation whatsoever? I mean, Cabinet Secretary, you say that bus companies are meant to consult. Well, you know, I'm sure members around the table will be aware of cases where that has not happened, and I certainly am. So what is the case? Are bus companies able just to remove services as they like at the moment?
Through the process that they have to in terms of engaging with local authority, regional transport partnerships, and through the Traffic Commissioner, that process remains the same. That's the same process it was pre-COVID-19. So a bus operator choosing to remove a bus service today is no different from the process that they would have had to have gone through at pre-COVID-19.
Mr. Smith had something to say.
Just very.
Sorry.
I don't think Graham's doing it.
I think I'm the convener here, but if you haven't got a follow-up, right. Well, you take your follow-up, and then I want to if Colin wants to come in, I'll bring him in. But Maureen has got a slightly separate question, so a follow-up from you.
I'll ask you if a slightly different issue, but relating to buses and the recovery. I know we want a green recovery, and we want people to get back to using public transport. You'll be aware, Cabinet Secretary, of the difficulties being experienced by the bus builder Alexander Dennis, a national company, an international company actually, with a base in Scotland. Can I ask what the Scottish Government, or what discussions the Scottish Government has had with the company, and what level of support the Scottish Government can offer for Alexander Dennis?
Convener, it's not only a company I'm aware of, it's a company that's based in my constituency, and I have a very close personal relationship with the company and long-standing knowledge of their operations. We've had very extensive discussions with Alexander Dennis's. The challenges which they face is that bus operators, due to the financial challenges which they're facing, as a result of the big drop-off in patronage which we experienced during the lockdown period, where basically the use of public transport dropped to about 10% of its normal daily use, has had a massive impact on the financial health of bus operators. And as a consequence, bus operators have become reluctant to place orders for new buses, which has had a direct impact on the order book that Alexander Dennis now have. They've gone from what was effectively a record year and looking into a record year to one where they have very little in the way of orders going forward. So the work that we've been undertaking is one, first of all, is to help to support and sustain the bus industry. So the £110 million that we've almost provided is to help to support and sustain bus services, continuing by meeting that gap in finances which they face as a result of physical distancing having to be maintained. Secondly, we've been working with Alexander Dennis's to make sure that they are as competitive as possible within the market on low carbon and ultra low emission buses, which is why we've brought forward a £10 million grant that was being made available by Scottish Enterprise, which was due to start next year into this year. So far in this financial year, they've been provided with almost £7 million of that fund. It was meant to be over 2 years and two £5 million chunks, but it's been advanced in order to help to support them in developing new technology around ultra-low emission buses. The second thing that we have taken forward is that we've also launched our the Scottish Ultra-Low Emission Bus Fund, which is providing, effectively, it's a new version of our Green Bus Fund that helps to support bus operators in purchasing new ultra-low emission buses. That fund is out there. A key part to that is that we have provided a new aspect to it, which is the first of its type in the UK, which is a bus leasing model that has been supported by the Scottish National Investment Bank, which is the first of the initiatives that the Scottish National Investment Bank have taken forward in order to try and help to support the industry, the bus industry, and looking at leasing buses rather than directly purchasing them, in order to encourage them to look at moving into placing new orders within the bus manufacturing sector. I expect that process has been undertaken just now, and we've been working very closely with Alexander Dennis around what implications it could have for them should orders develop. So we've undertaken a significant amount of work to try to help to support and stimulate the market here in Scotland. Having said that, 25% of Alexander Dennis's market is Scotland. The other 75% of its market is in other parts of the UK. I have asked the UK government to roll forward a similar type of approach in England, and to date they haven't done so. It's absolutely critical that we not only stimulate the market here in Scotland, but we stimulate it across the whole of the UK in order to start to generate orders, particularly on ultra-low emission buses, that can help to support critical businesses such as Alexander Dennis's. So we've had very extensive engagement with them. I hope I can give you an assurance about we're doing everything we can to stimulate the market here in Scotland within state aid rules. And what we need to do is to try and make sure that there's a wider stimulation across the rest of the UK in order to look to generate orders going forward where we can.
Cabinet Secretary, I'm just going to remind you, if I may, before I go back to Colin Smith, to the previous question. No, he's indicating he doesn't want to. Normal service has resumed in the sense that we are a meeting, and if I'm waggling my pen at you, I'm asking you to keep the answer concise. Please do look at me occasionally, just so I can get all members in, because the Deputy Convener wants to come in with a question.
I was just trying to be as helpful as possible to Mr Simpson and his question.
I understand that.
As full an answer as possible.
There are 30 questions that people have indicated.
I now know what wiggling your pen means, though.
Good. Deputy Convener, Maureen.
Thank you, Convener. I understand that Transport Scotland has provided £10 million for what's called pop-up bus infrastructure. Can you tell us what that money is to be spent on and what the impact it has on bus journeys and patronage levels?
So the purpose behind this is to try to help to support particularly local authorities in larger urban areas, to help to support them in identifying areas where they know they have key pinch points on their road network that can have an impact on bus journey times, and to support them in putting in place temporary infrastructure that could help to improve bus journey times and the frequency of bus services. So we've already had interest from Edinburgh, Dundee, Highland, and from several other local authorities, but for the three that I mentioned, we've agreed funding for them all, the first of which was Highland Council, and they've already started to look at deploying the infrastructure to provide dedicated bus routes. This is all part of trying to make sure that when we, as the restrictions ease, that we don't find people just simply falling back into the bad habits of using their cars to come into city centres, to make public transport as attractive as possible, and to make it as efficient as possible, and the pop-up bus infrastructures to help to support the bus industry in delivering that. So I've been very encouraged by the plans that have been brought forward by the local authorities today, who have been working with the bus companies to identify these key pinch points in order to make bus a much more attractive option for people when they do start moving back into the city centre to choose to use public transport, and bus in particular.
Thanks, Maureen. The next questions then are coming from Emma Harper. Emma.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I'm interested to know about how are we monitoring the compliance of face coverings on public transport. How has that been going, and has there been any concerns raised by transport staff or passengers about enforcement?
Good morning. Compliance as it stands at the present moment has been very high. So at the low end it would be around 80%, but on average it's sitting at 90 to 95% compliance. There have been points where there have been challenges around compliance with that in some areas, and where that has been identified, both ScotRail and British Transport Police and the rail network have taken proactive action to address the issues, to encourage people at particular stations, which has been an issue since the schools have gone back, to encourage young people in particular to make sure they have face coverings when they're using trains, and they've been engaging directly with local authorities and education departments to make sure that that message is emphasised through schools. I know my own kids have had stuff through. We've had things through because there's a lot of kids in their schools that use the trains to remind parents of the need to make sure their children are using face masks or on public transport. And again, on bus, compliance levels have been very high. So I haven't, I think at the early stages there were some issues of concern, particularly for staff, that they were felt as though that they may be asked to enforce this. That's not the intention. But by and large, compliance has been very high.
That's good to hear. And another programme is the Spaces for People programme. I'm just wondering if you're able to provide an update on the rollout of that. Many proposed schemes have encountered significant opposition, I've been hearing, and some have been removed and others are not progressed. So where are we with the rollout of the Spaces for People programme, and what lessons have been learned or can be learned to help roll it out for other future programmes?
Well, the Spaces for People programme is obviously to help to support people being able to cycle, walk and wheel, and to help to maintain physical distancing where possible. We've now provided almost £39 million to local authorities to take forward Spaces for People initiatives. A lot of local authorities are at different stages in rolling that forward. So, for example, here in Edinburgh, they're at a much more advanced level than maybe some other local authorities are. At Glasgow, at a very advanced level in terms of cycling infrastructure. I've made use of some of it myself, which has been fantastic. The difference it has made has been very, very significant. And we can see other local authorities rolling it forward. Some of the local authorities have had challenges in implementing it as a result of the companies which they use for this type of work have had to take staff off furlough, etc., which has delayed some of the progress that they've been able to make with it. But there's no doubt in my mind where it has been implemented and rolled out, it's made a real difference. It is, of course, important that local authorities engage with local communities when they're introducing these measures. And I understand that some local authorities have met opposition and concerns from local residents and some of the proposals which they have planned to take forward. And it's important local authorities try to address those concerns and to look at amending their plans if that's the appropriate thing to do. But it's important, I think, that we maximise the potential to capture the change in behaviour that Christine Graham made reference to, of people making greater use of active travel, and the Spaces for People programme is, I think, a very effective way for us to try and do that on a very quick basis and a very rapid basis, given the speed at which we're having to take some of these initiatives forward.
Thank you. Just a wee final sup. Part of some of the questions or the problems were keeping safe, segregated spaces for pedestrians and people using wheelchairs, and keeping them safe and from cyclists, for instance. So is that part of the challenges that need to be addressed, is safe, segregated spaces for everybody?
Yeah, there is. So part of the guidance that goes with the Spaces for People funding that was developed by Sustrans also has provision within it from the Mobility and Access Committee for Scotland, which gives advice on aspects relating to wheeling for wheelchairs, and also from RNIB for those who may have a visual impairment. So there's guidance there provided to local authorities around what they should be looking to put in place in designing these types of projects in order to try and address the needs of those who may have limited mobility or a sensory impairment that may impact on them. So there's good guidance there, and Sustrans will help to provide expert support and advice to local authorities as and when they need it in designing any projects that they're taking forward.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, Emma. Colin, I think you had a follow-up you wanted on that.
Convener, obviously, yesterday there was an announcement in the programme for government that the active travel budget for the next 5 years would be £500 million. Now, given that this year the active travel budget is £100.5 million, that's obviously a real terms cut over the next 5 years compared to this year. But one concern that's certainly been raised is that the Spaces for People budget of the 39 million, over 12 million, a third of it went on just 2 cities. And in the programme for government yesterday, you stated that work will now begin to assist local authorities turning some of the temporary schemes into permanent schemes. Now, given that a third went on just 2 cities, how are you planning on ensuring that we don't get another disproportionate amount going just onto 2 cities and not other parts of Scotland which are desperate for permanent measures but are likely to lose out because of that?
So let's be clear here, is that investment in active travel is at record levels. It's gone up to £100.5 million this year, this financial year. And for the first time, we're providing a 5-year funding programme for active travel at £500 million. That's a massive level of investment in active travel, and I've got no doubt it'll be, and has been, warmly welcomed by those within the active travel sector, and giving them greater certainty around future funding for investment in active travel going forward. What will happen now is that, as local authorities, it's worth keeping in mind is that the vast majority of the bids that have come in from different local authorities have by and large been met. So the scale and the nature and the ambition of the bids that were shaped at a local level is largely reflected by the decision-making by those individual local authorities. It'd be fair to say that Glasgow and Edinburgh have developed very extensive schemes, which in part may be reflective of the scale of the population base which they have, and also the ambition which they have. There are some local authorities, for example my own local authority, where the scale and nature of the bid was much more limited and of a much smaller scale. So the bids, we actually increased the pot again above the £30 million to try and meet all of the additional bids that come in as well. It'd be fair to say, though, is that the spread of those bids in terms of funding also demonstrated that it wasn't just the big urban cities. There was some real ambition from some of the rural authorities. Highland Council, for example, brought forward a number of additional proposals to their initial bid, which we were able to provide financial support for some of their active travel infrastructure. And of course, now that we have closed that process, we're now moving to the Spaces for Everyone programme, which is the permanent infrastructure, which will be the priority going forward. And it may be some of the temporary infrastructure can be converted to permanent infrastructure if that's what local authorities want to do within their individual areas.
Colin, you want to come back briefly?
With respect, you didn't answer the specific question. I mean, you've acknowledged that because this year's budget is 105 million, then over the next 5 years, 500 million is a physical cut and a... Sorry,
it's not
100.5 million is this year's budget, so 500 million. You don't have to do the maths. 500 million over 5 years is a cash cut per year. It's also a real terms cut over the next few years, so there will be a lower budget than is available this year for active travel. And my question was very specifically, given that a third of the funding for spaces for people, which tackled a very specific problem, a third of that went to 2 cities. They don't have a third of the population. And if the priority is now to assist those cities and others turning temporary schemes into permanent schemes, how do you make sure that a big proportion above the population proportion does not continue to go to those areas and other parts of the country who for a variety of reasons, did not pursue the spaces for people because it wasn't relevant to them. It was ultimately about safe travel during COVID-19. That's not the same as the spaces for the places for everyone, which is about promoting active travel. So how do you make sure those areas in a smaller budget in real terms are not disproportionately disadvantaged in the same way they have been during this scheme?
I think it'd be unfair to try and characterise that local authorities weren't that interested. Some local authorities weren't that interested in the spaces for people. I'm not saying you did, but I don't think it'd be right to characterise it that way, because all I think bar 2 local authorities put bids in for the Spaces for People initiative. And clearly some have had much more ambitious plans than others. What we have done is we've increased the financial envelope even further to try and accommodate additional bids that were brought in at a later stage from a number of different local authorities, including rural local authorities, to support them in taking forward Spaces for People initiative. But you know, the record funding that we're putting into active travel, I've got absolutely no doubt will help to deliver the infrastructure that is necessary to help to support people in being able to choose active travel. And the very significant announcement of £500 million, the biggest investment over the course of the next 5 years that's ever been made in active travel, will give us greater certainty on how we'll go about making sure that we deliver that permanent infrastructure.
Okay, I'm not going to bring you back in, Colin. I see you itching to come back in, but I'm going to go to John Finney because he's got some questions. John.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Good morning, panel. I have some questions on the Transport Transition Plan, but perhaps in advance of that, can I commend Highland Council, something I don't regularly do, because they were extremely quick off the mark. They got a significant sum of money, which isn't just in urban areas, but it's actually been rolled out. Now, it's a very modest start in the scheme of things, as I would view the overall budget, but I think it's fair to record that in respect of Highland Council. The Transport Transition Plan, you alluded to in your opening statement, Cabinet Secretary, published on 26th of May to manage the 4 stages. If I noted you correctly, you said it continues to evolve, and you touched on issues of demand and capacity. There's a national advisory group being established to share best practice and help align local and national action. I wonder, can you comment on the work that they're doing, please? And particularly, how close is that alignment? If you check many lampposts in this city here, you'll see that they talk about decarbonisation by 2030. Is there that level of alignment?
Okay, so you're correct in saying that there is, as I mentioned, the Transport Transition Plan is an evolving plan, so it's now at a very advanced stage. A big part of the element that we are working on just now in moving forward is looking at travel demand management. So as we move through the route map and as people start to return to work or to school is how we manage that demand. So a lot of the focus around the Transport Transition Plan has been about making sure we maximise capacity in the public transport network to support people as the restrictions ease, but also helping to scale up and provide a greater range of options on active travel, for example, through the Spaces for People Fund and also through the Bus Rapid Deployment Fund. I'm going to ask Alison to say a bit more about the specific work we're doing in partnership. So around the shape of making sure the approach that we are taking at a national level is aligned at a regional level. So there is a particular focus on our big urban areas, in particular, Glasgow and Edinburgh and the city regions there, looking at how we can support them in helping to design the type of public transport provision that they want to put in place to support the move through the route map. That's part, for example, again, the bus rapid infrastructure fund is to help to support that. But Alison, who leads on this piece of work and is a member of the group, can tell you a bit more about exactly the measures that we're taking forward and the nature of the discussions that are taking place.
Okay, thank you. So we've established the National Advisory Group and also we have two what we call regional groups that are set up to support the Glasgow and the Edinburgh city regions, and those two areas were identified specifically because of the scale of public transport usage in the area and the scale of the challenge that we saw. The National Advisory Group we use as part of the process, and there's a lot of engagement going on across the whole of Transport Scotland, so it's not the only source of place. But what that does for us is it brings in other sort of the rest of the country, the regional transport partnerships. We have the Scottish Society of Chief Transportation Officers and similarly the Chief Executives equivalent, who are all representative on that. We are able to share the activity of Transport Scotland and the rest of the Scottish Government, but also hear what issues are maybe arising in other parts of the country to make sure that we're addressing them as far as possible. The two regional groups that we've set up for the Glasgow and Edinburgh city regions have met effectively weekly over the course of the summer. There's been a lot of work been undertaken collaboratively to understand the scale of the challenge in terms of the levels of demand as we move through the route map, where they may manifest themselves in terms of hotspots on the transport network, particularly the bus and rail networks. And that then has led to the identification of a range of options, which we're now starting to take forward. And as we've talked about already, some of that is coming through in the Bus Rapid Deployment Fund bids that we're getting back from both of those city regions, and those measures will be rolled out. Part of it's coming through the Spaces for People measures, and part of that is associated with communications and messaging and working with employers, for example, in those areas to help us both understand what the challenges are, but also to manage some of the impacts. That work is evolving because we are in rather... I'm sorry, are you waving your finger at me? I wasn't looking at you. Sorry.
I know, it's always a danger that you catch out of the corner of your eye. I was trying to encourage you because I know John's got some further questions which you might be able to add to as well.
Okay, sum up, quite a lot of work, a lot of engagement and a lot of really good collaborative working, and it's evolving.
Okay, thanks very much, indeed. Indeed, Convener, I'm going to ask briefly on two other groups, the Rail Recovery Task Force and the Multi-Agency Response Team. So, firstly, on the Rail Recovery Task Force, Cabinet Secretary, is that simply to take us back to where we were pre-COVID, or is there opportunities to look at perhaps taking a different direction? And can I ask, back to the thing I regularly correspond with you about rail freight, there's been some extremely good developments in relation to that. For the first time in 14 years, thousands and thousands of tonnes of timber from the far north conveyed. Can you talk about the rail recovery plan, please?
Yep, so the purpose of the Rail Recovery Task Force was to help to manage the ramping up of rail services as we move through the route map and to look at what specific measures had to be put in place as we move through that particular process. So we went from a stage where services were around 30 or so % of normal service delivery to incremental changes in the level of rail services that were being provided. So it went up to, I think, 43%, and then we moved it further up and eventually up to the 91% we have at the present moment. So the Rail Recovery Group have been responsible for looking at and planning and managing that. And a key part of the work that they've been taking forward is to make sure that we were looking at increasing rail capacity ahead of decisions that we were making on the route map, which could potentially, with an easing of restrictions, that could increase levels of demand. So we've been working it in a way that has been a step ahead of the decisions around the route map and as restrictions were eased. Alongside that, the MAP, which is the multi-agency team, which has been working, has been bringing together a whole range of different public transport providers from rail and bus local authorities to identify where there may be capacity constraints or concerns being raised, and to then look at trying to identify those issues and to address them as quickly as possible as well. So the MAP has a slightly different role. It's trying to identify where there are problems in the transport network and to try and address those as quickly as we can, particularly around physical distancing. I'll ask Bill to say a wee bit about the Rail Recovery Group, because its primary function is to help to manage going through the route map as opposed to it being something much wider than that. And also, Bill can touch a bit on the work we're doing around freight, because we've obviously made the rail freight grant available, and the scheme which is now operating in the Northern Line is a very good example of how the fund is actually now starting to have a real impact in encouraging the use of rail freight.
I think, Convener, if I understood the signal correctly, that was a request to be brief in the answer, so I will
encourage people to be brief and succinct, but I know that you will be.
So, the Rail Recovery Task Force has been really helpful in allowing us to plan the response as we've gone through the various stages of the recovery. It comprises membership of ScotRail, Network Rail, Transport Scotland, but importantly also is our means of engaging with groups like Transport Focus, with the passengers' interest, with British Transport Police, and very importantly with staff representatives through a partnership working group with the trade union engagement. That has helped us respond, I think, really very quickly to changes in demand pattern, and as we've had to respond to the different stages of the recovery, and is also facilitating us looking forward to how those demand patterns may change. It's looked not just at demand and anticipating demand, and we've tried to stay ahead of the curve so that we can maintain social distancing. Very importantly has been monitoring and applying best practice around passenger and staff safety as well. So I think that collaborative approach has proved to be hugely successful, and is one that we would wish to build on as we go forward to the changes which we will have to make to address changing transport patterns. Turning to the rail freight, I can only endorse what you said, Mr. Finney, about the success, how good it was to be able to conduct that timber trial on the Far North Line recently. The trial's now subject to evaluation, but it's part of a wider range of initiatives that we've got underway to promote development of rail freight in Scotland. There's another project for a timber loading terminal at Rannoch that's making good progress, which will take a lot of timber off the roads in that area, as well as the exciting project at Blackford for the Highland Spring. So I'm pleased to say that folk across Britain are looking at what we're doing in Scotland for the...
There's a project there, yes.
Yeah, so there have been a couple of trials of new freight flows, one from Aberdeen to Suffolk during the course of lockdown. So the rail freight industry is not forgotten in all of this, and we're doing everything we can to support those developing initiatives.
Yes, thank you. That's very reassuring. I'm conscious of time. There's been a series of impact assessments that Transport Scotland's committed to bringing forward, Cabinet Secretary. Qualities Impact Assessment, a Fairer Scotland Duty Assessment, a Child Rights and Wellbeing Impact Assessment of the Transport Transition Plan. Are you able to say if these have been completed If so, what their main findings were, and if not, when we can expect to see these assessments, please.
So I'll get Alison to say a bit more on this because she's leading in part of this work. But this is to make sure that we meet our statutory obligations around aspects of the Transport Transition Plan and to make sure that we're taking into account the wider issues around equalities, human rights, etc. that are being considered in any work we're taking forward. But Alison can say a bit more about where the progress has been made with these.
Okay, so again, this is a really fundamental part of the work that we're doing to support the Transport Transition Plan. I think we're all aware of some of the inequalities, and in fact we've already touched on some of the issues already at the committee this morning. My team are undertaking the statutory assessments that are required by law in order to support the work that we're doing. Because I think the plan is evolving and also because the work is ongoing, it's difficult to point to an end point and say, right, okay, well, here is the report and here is the transition plan. So we're now at the point where we've established a equalities network where we're drawing in sort of the lived experience from a range of interest groups that are helping us with that work, that are helping us to identify the actions that we need to take. At present, the majority of those actions are around the response that we've had from the Mobility and Access Committee, which we're picking up through the advice on spaces for people, etc. We expect that to evolve as the impacts of the COVID pandemic on other parts of society start to manifest themselves. And I'm particularly thinking around the poverty aspect and particularly around young people. So I can see that's where we're likely to go. We're conscious of the fact, because there isn't, at this point in time, a defined end point, where we would publish the impact assessments as we would with a normal piece of work, that there might be a case for publishing an interim report just so that we can make clear to people what we're doing. So that's something that we're looking at with a view to doing that over the coming weeks.
Thank you, John. There's some next. Stuart Stevenson has got a series of questions, I think. Stuart.
Thank you, Convener. I want to ask a number of questions about the emergency measures agreement under which across the GB network franchises are now operating. The first one is just a purely technical question, and that is with the Office of National Statistics categorising the train operating companies now as public non-financial corporations. Does that have any practical effect that you'd want to bring to our attention?
On the specific point, it doesn't have any direct implications for ownership, legal status, or for the management of rail services through train operating companies. It's more of an issue around how it will be recorded by the ONS. And any official statistics, and officials in Transport Scotland are making sure that the decision made by the ONS on this matter is reflected in our reporting process, but it has got no real practical implications for as I say, the operation or the ongoing management of rail services.
Stuart.
Thank you, Camilla. So we'll just need to be careful about future comparisons, but that's for another day. More importantly, it looks like the EMAs will continue for some time. So in relation to ScotRail, have we a sense of what the ongoing costs of that are likely to be to the Scottish Government's budget?
So the existing EMA, which was introduced earlier this year, expires on the 20th of September for both the ScotRail and also for the sleeper franchises. The approximate cost of that is in the region of around £250 million over both of the EMAs for the sleeper and for ScotRail. We're presently looking at options beyond the 20th of September including the option of a further EMA. I think you're correct to say that there remains very significant challenges on the rail sector, given that patronage numbers are so low and continue to be so low. But a further EMA is one of the options that we're looking at the present moment as an extension to the existing one that we have in place.
Just before you come back, I'm sorry, Cabinet Secretary, I didn't quite hear the answer. The £250 million, for how many months was that for?
So that runs for 6 months is the initial EMA. So
the only cost, or the cost annually, it is 500 million.
Well, part of it is dependent upon, so the final cost depend on things like fare box recovery, etc. So as we go through the route map and as patronage levels have increased slightly, fare box will have increased slightly, which has an impact on what the overall cost. So right now it's approximately £250 million, but there's a reconciliation process that will be gone through to arrive at the final figure. What the cost will be going forward is dependent upon patronage levels as well, which again could have an impact on it. But if you were to say at a basic level, is it £500 million? Potentially it could be, but as I say, there's a reconciliation process that identifies the exact final costs.
Sorry, and just if I may, Stuart, one more, just on, so I understand that cost. That's when rail services were running at a slightly reduced level. So, I mean, I'm assuming that the cost for the rail services is from what we've heard before, about a third for infrastructure, a third for the equipment hire, i.e. the trains, and a third for staff. Now, the staff cost might have been reduced. Well, none of it would have been reduced. Are you saying that's the maximum cost then for the 6 months?
That's what we would expect it to be, yes. So that would be the maximum cost, but there may be a threshold below that, again, as a result of things like patronage levels increasing and fare box increasing, which could have an impact in the final reconciliation of the figure.
Okay, I'll need to look back at the figures that Abellio had given the committee prior to that, but it seems somewhat low. Sorry, Stuart, I interrupted you. I apologise. Stuart.
Well, let me move, convener, just to my final issue. The Williams review is underway, has been for some time. Clearly, as we're all across the GB network running under EMAs, it's an opportunity to explore the practical effects of a different model of operating the rail companies from the traditional franchises. How are we feeding into the Williams review, particularly in relation to the wider COVID response and the effect that's had on the railway and the different model of operating that we're currently working under?
Well, the Williams review is now complete. I've met with Keith Williams on several occasions to set out the Scottish Government's position on this matter, in our view that there should be a single structure integrating infrastructure and also passenger services, and that we require the powers in Scotland in order to allow us to create that structure here for Scotland's railways. The report was submitted obviously to the UK Government and to the Secretary of State for Transport UK level. We were expecting a UK rail white paper in the autumn of last year. That was obviously delayed. As it stands at the present moment, we have been given no indication from the UK Government on its plans around the Williams review and any rail white paper. The last reference that I've seen in this issue was when Grant Sharps was at the Transport Select Committee. I think it was in June of this year, where he said that some aspects of the pandemic have overtaken some of the issues that had been identified in the Williams review, but there has been no indication to date as to what will come from it. So we are still in a position where we are unsighted on what the plans are for the future shape of rail services, and given where we are with the need to make use of EMAs and uncertainty going forward, what my view is absolutely critical is that we have clarity on the scope of our powers to reshape rail services in Scotland going forward. And until we have that, it does create a level of uncertainty around what our options may be for future rail services in Scotland.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Colin, you wanted to come in briefly, I think.
Brief follow-up on the last two questions, Convener. You obviously not published the EMA, but you've estimated it will cost £250 million for the 6-month period. What's your estimate of the management fee that's paid to Abilio and Serco for that agreement? And you said specifically that extending the EMA was one option. What are the other options that you're currently looking at? And is one of those options surely to bring those franchises under public control and run them with an operator of last resort rather than handing another £250 million plus to private companies?
So the way in which the EMAs operate is they operate in what is in a cap basis for any management fee. That's capped at 2%. I'll get Bill to say a bit more about the practicalities of that. So there is a capping of that across the board. In terms of our other options is just to go back to the full franchise and just to let that run in the way in which it was operating. But clearly, given patronage levels and fare box, etc., it financially would be unsustainable, which is why EMAs have been introduced. The other option is that we go to operator of last resort. The problem is that operator of last resort is something which you would implement for a limited period of time. Unless we have the full devolved powers around our options in running rail services in the future, including the infrastructure element of it, we will not be able to implement that public sector controlled public railway that you call for, because we have restricted powers and powers to make decisions around that lie with the UK government. So our options are extremely limited. So you could have an operator of last resort for a limited period of time, but if they don't give us more extensive powers around decision making in this area, we are forced back into the route of having to look at a further franchise, despite the fact that I believe that the franchise system is bust. It's no longer fit for purpose, and it has to be withdrawn. And that's why I want to have full control over both the passenger and infrastructure for rail in Scotland, to allow us to make those decisions in a way that allows us to run a public rail service for the people of Scotland that reflects their needs. And I'll ask Bill to say a bit more about the structure of the EMA and also the publication of the details that we'll provide around it.
Just before Bill does, John has a question which he wants to slip in, and Bill might be able to answer it at the same time.
Thank you very much indeed, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, you've previously chaired meetings, your predecessor chaired meetings about public ownership. You're not suggesting that it would be impossible for the Scottish Government to have public ownership of the operator without the infrastructure, or is that what you're saying?
You could have a public sector organisation could make a bid to run a franchise. The danger for that public sector organisation is that they carry all the risks that go with a franchise. And my view is that the way in which franchises operate is no longer fit for purpose. We need to move away from franchises altogether and to have a single operating structure. So I'm not in favour of franchises. I want to get rid of them. And I want to have the powers to be able to take forward a structure that allows us to ensure we can do that.
Of doubt, I share your position on that, as you're aware, but there is a middle course perhaps, and that is operator.
Do you want to add anything briefly? I'm just conscious there's a lot more questions I need to...
But perhaps just to make clear that the additional costs involved in the EMA, the Emergency Measures Agreement, reflect the difference between the operating cost and the revenue. So in other words, how much money we're getting from the passengers and how much money therefore still needs to be paid to cover costs that's not covered by the revenue. That, I think, is that doesn't go away in the event of an operator of last resort. So it's just worth remembering that there is this substantial gap between the lower revenue level that current patronage it makes available and the operating costs of the national ScotRail network. And that needs to be met under whatever model we choose to go forward with.
Thank you, and I apologise. I think we're going to have to leave railways at the moment and move on to the next topic, which is Angus. I think you've got questions on it. Angus.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary and to your officials. If we could look at the provisions in the Transport Scotland Act, including LEZs and pavement parking, to name but two. We know that the programme for government for 2017-18 gave a commitment to have at least one LEZ in operation in 2018 and LEZs in the 4 biggest cities during 2020. So could you explain to the committee why the rollout of LEZs has been delayed until 2022? What consideration has been given to applying more stringent emission standards given this delay? And can you clarify when drivers may become liable for paying penalties for breaching LEZ emission limits?
Good morning. The reason that there was a pausing of the progress around low emission zones is not because we aren't determined to continue to tackle the issue of air quality that's associated with traffic. It was a reflection of the practical challenges of taking forward some of this work during the course of the pandemic, both from a practical point of view in terms of officials within Transport Scotland who had to pivot towards dealing with COVID-19 issues rather than dealing with the regulations and the work associated with LEZs, and equally in local authorities that they had also highlighted to us that staff who were dealing with issues around LEZs and the process that they take them through their committee structure had to shift to deal with some of the wider challenges they had around the pandemic. So it was a practical measure to try and address the challenge that staff in Transport Scotland and local authorities faced during the pandemic. We've now had an opportunity to review that process. The leadership group met a number of weeks ago, and the indicative time frame now is that they'll be taken forward with introduction between February and May 2022. That's to allow the statutory process that we have to go through, both through any regulations at a national level, but also the process that local authorities have to go through as part of that statutory requirement, and the lead-in time that they require for being able to do that. So that was the earliest timescale we've seen as being practical now for them being taken forward. On your two other points, in terms of more stringent emissions, we are looking at that. So we discussed that at the leadership group, looking at whether we should be introducing more stringent restrictions on emission standards, and that's presently being considered at the moment and will be looked at again by the leadership group. And on the issue of liability to pay penalties associated with LEZs, there is obviously a grace period of at least a year that's provided for when an LEZ is introduced, and therefore penalties will start to apply from the point when between February and May 2022, when cities introduce them, they will have the opportunity to set what that grace period will be. And once the grace period is complete, penalties will start to apply. So I would expect the penalties in some of these areas to start to apply in 2023, given us a year they have to give.
Okay, thanks. Well, here's hoping that the new timeline is adhered to. With regard to another aspect of the Transport Act, pavement parking, can you advise us when the prohibitions on pavement parking, double parking and parking in front of dropped curbs will come into force?
So again, a bit like it was with the LEZs, the officials who were working on the regulations and guidance and the statutory instruments that are associated with some of the specific provisions within the Transport Act have had to shift on to dealing with COVID-19 issues. They're now moving back into dealing with these matters. So we are now looking to progress elements around the parking prohibition and some of the regulations that will be necessary for that. Part of that is dependent upon parliamentary timetable, because some of it has to come before Parliament as well. So staff are now moving towards that. I can't give you a specific date because I don't control all of that process, but I can assure you that staff are now moving back into looking at progress in some of this work, and then it'll be part dependent upon the parliamentary process for slots and bringing forward the SIs that need to be considered by Parliament.
Of Parliament?
I don't know whether there'll be parliamentary space in the timetable. We're engaged with the parliamentary office around that, but I don't know whether there'll be parliamentary space to get it complete in this parliamentary term.
Fair enough. With regard to other provisions in the Transport Scotland Act 2019 being brought into force Can you give us an update on bus service regulation and ticketing and any other aspects that you think we should be aware of?
So again, it's the same as it was for the parking provisions, as staff now moving back in to take forward some of this work. Once I'm in a position where I have a clearer line of sight on the process for and the timeline for taking some of these forward, I'll be able to update the committee on that. But I can't at this stage, just given the stage at which staff are now moving back into taking forward some of this work around the Transport Act.
Okay, we'll certainly look forward to that update. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll move on to the next question. It appears we haven't left railways altogether. John Finney.
Thank you very much, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, can you provide an update, please, on the development of the Leavenmouth rail link, particularly when you expect the line to reopen, and also the associated improvements to bus services and active travel infrastructure, when that's likely to come on stream, please?
Yes, so the project for Leavenmouth is part of our rail enhancements and capital investment programme in CP6. The design phase of the project is progressing well in its two programme, with the development of various different parts of the infrastructure options well underway now. These options include looking at passenger elements, stations, and also the possibility of freight on the route. There's a fairly wide approach being taken to that design process that's been taken forward. The intention is for that project to be delivered in control period 6. Part of what they are presently looking at is some of the work that we may do on the Leavenmouth line could have a wider impact on the Fife Circle. So, for example, in looking at electrification and aspects of it. So what I've asked Network Rail to do is to make sure that if we are looking at making a specific provision around electrification of the Leavenmouth line, for example, then we should, or at least getting it ready to go to be electrified, is that we're looking at how that builds into the work programme around the wider Fife Circle enhancement programme. So it's trying to align both of these, which is part of the challenge. But the intention is to take it forward in control period 6. On your point around the active travel and the bus aspect of it, those are aspects that have been taken forward by the local authority, and I'm afraid I don't have an up-to-date position on what that is. But you'll be aware that we are providing £5 million for additional works to help to enhance aspects that could help to support use of the railway, which the local authority have agreed to match fund, part of which is to help to support better bus provision and also active travel provision. So it's on plan and to programme, but we're trying to fit it into some of the wider work that we are looking around the decarbonisation of the wider rail network and how that could be designed to meet any changes in the wider Fife routes.
I'm getting skilled at by the convener here. If I can just allude to media reports indicating construction could start next year and the line reopen in 2023. Is there any basis in that, please?
I'm not aware of the media reports, but what I can say to you is that in my discussions with Network Rail, my ambition to get it complete within the control period 6 timescale has been emphasised to them, and has been recognised by them. So I'm keen for them to make as much progress as quickly as possible, and Alec Hines is well aware of that.
Graham Simpson, you've got a question there.
I do. Can I just thank you for your earlier answer about Alexander Dennis, and hopefully we can have a chat about that. I want to ask about a couple of really key roads, the A9 and the A96. So both planned for dualling, or dualling is already taking place, as is the case on the A9. So on the A9, it's one question really. On the A9, is the project still on target to finish by 2025? And if it's not, when do you expect it to be complete? And on the A96, is it still your wish to dual the entire road, or have you had a rethink on that? And what's the projected timescale?
Okay, so on your latter point, yep, it remains our commitment to dual the A96 to the intended timeframes going forward. Part of that is dependent upon the statutory process that we go through for major infrastructure projects of that nature, but it means a committed project for us. On the A9, you're right, we have already completed some of the duelling. What is happening is that the contractors are presently considering some of the time it's been lost during the period of the pandemic to see whether that can be built back into the programme. So the time frame remains 2025, and as I say, the contractors are presently looking at whether they can draw back in some of the time that has been lost during the course of the lockdown restrictions.
Okay, thank you, Graham. Now, Cabinet Secretary, I had some questions on the NTS2 and the STPR2 and how they were going to change during COVID. I may slip those questions on the basis that other members do also have questions, and the committee clerks will write to you with the questions on that and ask you to update. I do have one question that I'm not going to move away from. The rest and be thankful. Doesn't appear we have much to be thankful all the time about the rest and be thankful. It seems to spend a lot of time closed. Are the latest repairs going to be the final thing, or how are you going to solve it? Very briefly.
Do you mean the latest repair is the final thing to what we do in the rest and be thankful as an alternative route?
Time. Sorry.
Sorry, I was just asking, do you mean is it the final thing? Are we going to do anything else on the...
Well, I'm asking what, as to the future, there are temporary repairs that are being carried out at the moment. And let's say that the staff that are doing that are working really hard, and I appreciate the updates that we constantly get. But it is an ongoing problem, and I'd like to know just briefly what the solution for it is.
Okay, so you're right, our trunk road operating company, Bear, have put in a tremendous amount of work to try and repair the damage that was caused to the rest, and be thankful. They're making good progress with that. It is weather-dependent work, but they continue to make good progress on it. So our plan going forward is to continue with mitigation measures. So there's a further catch pit that is due to start on the rest, and be thankful as soon as they have completed the repairs to the section that is damaged. That's further up the road. They're also designing a further potential catch pit, an area where the most recent landslip has taken place. So mitigation measures will continue, because the road will continue to be the main route into parts of Argyll. Last week at the task force meeting, I set out that we would be taking forward work to identify an alternative route to the existing alignment of the rest and be thankful. We expect to have 11 different options which will go out to consultation in December, with that process being complete by the early part of next year, and I expect to be in a position by the spring of next year to set out what the preferred option is for that alternative route to the existing rest and be thankful route. So that gives us a clear commitment to not only continuing with mitigation measures, but also identifying an alternative route to the existing rest and be thankful.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The next question comes from Mike Rumbles. Mike.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. My question is basically on Prestwick Airport. Media reports highlight that the airport made an operating profit for the first time in, I think, 13 years, a profit of £3 million, which is very good news. But the debt to the Scottish taxpayer stands, as I understand it, as 38.4 million, which are the loans given by the Scottish Government to Prestwick. So when do you think that the taxpayer will get her money back from these loans?
Good morning. So
I'm sorry, I'm trying to manage the time, and it's quite difficult to listen to the questions when people are asking me. The committee made it quite clear to me that they had various commitments that needed them to finish by 12. There are questions from Mike Rumbles on this. There are a series of questions from other committee members. I apologise that I've had to cut a question, but I'm afraid I must be allowed to do that. And on that note, Mr. Rumbles, could you please repeat your question? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear it all.
Okay. Media reports highlight that the airport made an operating profit for the first time in 13 years, which is £3 million. But the debt to the taxpayer stands, as I understand it, as £38.4 million, which are the loans given by the Scottish Government to Prestwick. So I was asking the Cabinet Secretary, which I think he heard, when do you think that the taxpayer will get our money back from these loans?
Okay, so Mr Rumbles, good morning. It is correct to point out that the Prestwick Airport have reported an operating profit of £3 million for 2019-2020, which is based on a 46% in growth of their in their revenue, and I'm very grateful for the significant amount of work that the management team at Prestwick Airport have put into this, along with the board, in driving forward the turnaround at the airport. You're correct, there is the commercial loan which is associated with the airport that remains outstanding. It's obviously a matter which would be part of any sales process going forward, given that it's an outstanding amount that's associated with the business. But having said that, I don't think we should underestimate the importance of Prestwick Airport to the Ayrshire economy and the very significant amount of employment that is associated with the airport, particularly within the aerospace and aviation sector itself. And had we not provided that commercial loan to Prestwick Airport, then it would no longer be operating, and it could potentially have a very significant impact on employment within the area. So it's a debt which remains outstanding. It will be part of any sales process, but we shouldn't underestimate the importance of the government making that funding available to the airport, given the importance it has to the Ayrshire economy, employment within the aerospace and the aviation sector.
Mike, I appreciate all of that, and thank you for that answer, but I'm just concerned. I know it's for sale, and you had a preferred bidder. I'd like to know where we stand with that preferred bidder, whatever you can tell us about it. I know there may be issues that are commercial confidential, but whatever you can tell us about it would be helpful. And I just wonder, you recognise that there's £38 million plus of taxpayers' money here, and it will be part of the sale. You don't intend to write that money off, I hope.
So what I'm not going to do is to start to give you details around any commercial transaction around the sale of it. It would be inappropriate for me to do so. We're in a position, as I've mentioned to I think the committee in Parliament before, where we've extended the time frame for the negotiations to be taken forward. At the request of the interested party on the basis of the pandemic and the impact it's had on their capacity and also Prestwick Airport's capacity. So we still have an interested party, but the time frame for those discussions have been extended. But I'm not going to get into any of the details relating to the commercial loan that's associated with the airport while these negotiations are taking place.
I wouldn't expect you to, but just bear in mind that we are conscious that this is public money.
I am acutely aware it's public money. You're not the only person that's acutely aware of it. I'm also acutely aware of the hundreds of jobs that have been dependent upon us making that loan available. And the many livelihoods that are dependent upon the intervention of the Scottish Government in helping to secure and maintain Prestwick Airport, which, had we not done so, could have had a catastrophic impact on the Ayrshire economy.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Maureen Moore, you wanted to come in on that.
Yes, thank you, Convener. Just briefly, during the pandemic, especially the West Coast seafood producers have been using Prestwick Airport to get their product to market. Is there anything more that can be done to encourage other food producers, fish for example, to use Prestwick Airport as a freight hub rather than trucking down to Dover? And especially with Brexit coming, that alternative looks to me to be a real goer in case fresh produce is stuck at Dover in some lorry park somewhere and goes off. So, I mean, through the Chambers of Commerce, Federation of Small Business, offering Prestwick as a hub for their produce to get to market. So
Prestwick has got a very significant freight capacity that's well utilised and well recognised within the industry. I think it'd be fair to say that those food producers are looking at using air freight as opposed to road freight will be looking at the costs associated with it. Air freight is much more expensive than road freight, and it would obviously be a commercial decision for for food operators to choose to use air freight instead, but there would be capacity at Prestwick Airport to be able to provide any demand that may arise, but it would be a commercial decision for food operators to choose to switch to air freight. In terms of Brexit preparations, it was part of our planning and our contingency was to look at if there were problems at the short straits at Dover, which could impact on Scottish food produce getting to European markets, is that air freight was one of the routes that had been identified as an option, and we had already undertaken some modelling and options around what we could put in place to help to support producers should they have to switch to air freight. But obviously we'll revisit that depending where we go with the Brexit and the potential for a no-deal Brexit. But it would be largely a commercial decision because it would be fair to say that air freight is significantly more costly than road freight.
Okay, thank you.
Just a quick question I have on that, the 46% growth in revenue. When we looked at Prestwick Airport's trading in previous years, a huge amount of that was, the revenue was from fuel trading with actually National Guard aeroplanes and the American Air Force. How much of that 46% increase is down to fuel trading and how much of it is down to freight, Cabinet Secretary, please?
I don't have that information. It'd be information you'd have to ask Prestwick Airport for as the operators.
Could you write to us with that figure?
I could ask the airport to do so. It's run on a commercial basis. It's not run by the Scottish Government, and it would be for them to provide you with that information. It may be that some of that information would be commercially sensitive and they wouldn't be prepared to put it in the public domain, but I don't know. But we can ask Prestwick Airport to respond to the point you've made.
Thank you. Now we have a series of questions. I've got Christine Brown, Emma Harper, Graham Simpson, Oliver Mundell. Christine, do you want to kick off?
The Cabinet Secretary will be aware, because I've raised with him about the severe damage on the A68 with the heavy rain. I mean, something at Fala, something the size of a sinkhole's appearing, is causing a great deal of problems for people commuting the A68, but also diversions across to the A7 through wee villages like Stow. There appeared to be issues with utilities not getting the work done and therefore holding up that. Maybe I've got that wrong. Perhaps if the Cabinet Secretary could clarify that particular thing and when it will reopen.
So I'm aware, and I know that Christine Graham's raised this matter directly with me, given the impact it's having on our constituents. My understanding is that they are making good progress. So there were some challenges around utilities, which involve telecoms and digital utilities. That work, I understand, is all complete now, or well progressed. You know, given if the weather holds and we don't have further significant periods of wet weather, my understanding is that into the early part of this month and in the next couple of weeks, they expect to have the work complete. So the contractors are making as much progress as they can, given the fair weather they've had at the present moment. But I understand the utility issue has been by and large addressed, or if it's not been completely addressed, is being addressed.
Okay, thank you.
Emma Harper.
Thank you, Convener. I will try and really be quick. Maureen brought up the issues about Prestwick Airport and hauliers and Brexit, but the Port of Cairnryan is really, really important as well. And I'm wondering what engagement the UK Government has had with the Scottish Government about planning for port infrastructure or Irish border issues, or, you know, our main arterial routes that are to and from Cairnryan are really, really important. So I'm just wondering what engagement the UK Government have had with the Scottish Government around the infrastructure at Cairnryan, for instance.
So we've, you'll be aware that in preparations for the for Brexit, we'd looked at contingency arrangements at Cairnryan, given the potential impact it could have on the port, what we, I would. It'd be fair to say is that what we haven't had is clarity from the UK Government on exactly what their intentions are in terms of any customs point between mainland UK and Ireland and Northern Ireland. It's unclear at this stage. It appears to be that there is an intention to have some form of customs check, Whether that will be in the Northern Ireland side or whether it will be in the Scottish side is still unclear. It would appear that it may be on the Northern Irish side. But it's also unclear as to exactly what their plans are in managing that. So I can't give you greater clarity on that because we haven't been provided that with by the UK government. But it's something we'll continue to press them on because it potentially could have an impact on the local community.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
I'm going to change the position because Oliver's indicated that your question is broadly in this area as well. So I'm going to come to Oliver Mundell and then Graham Simpson. Oliver.
Thank you, Convener. I'm interested to see the response you've requested from the Cabinet Secretary on the National Transport Strategy and the Strategic Transport Projects Review when he writes, but on a specific point, it's now been almost 1,500 days since the Deputy First Minister convened a much heralded transport summit to look at the issues affecting the A75 and A77, both major trunk routes serving the ferry service at Cairnryan, and in the case of the A75 connecting Northern Ireland, Southern Ireland and the north of England. Over 4 years later, we're still waiting. It's now been 13 years unlucky under this SNP government. So will the Cabinet Secretary finally commit today to unlocking South West Scotland's economic potential and confirming plans to dual the A75 and upgrade the A77? Or will they simply be forgotten again as part of this review?
So I'm looking that way to try and see through the screen, Mr. Mundell. So
it's a little bit off-putting. It's hard to eyeball you through.
It's difficult because there's a slight bevel shape in that as well. So
each other up. So, Cabinet Secretary, if you'd like to answer the question.
So it's important to recognise that the issues associated with the A75 and A77 are not lost. They remain a key part of the Scottish Government's STPR2 process. We've already completed the pre-appraisal process, published that report a number of months ago that sets out, I think it's a region of something like 23 different interventions for the southwest of Scotland. That work is now, obviously there's aspects of the STPR2 that have been delayed due to the pandemic, but that work is moving forward, which will allow us to then focus on what the recommendations are from the appraisal for both the A75 and the A77, and that will then be part of our ongoing programme of work in order to look at what those investments should actually be in order to address the issues that have been highlighted during the course of the appraisal process. So the member can be assured that the importance of both these roads are extremely important and they are part of the appraisal process that's already been undertaken, which will allow us to identify what the appropriate interventions are.
Does the Cabinet Secretary accept, though, that people living in that part of the world are not going to believe the Scottish Government's commitment until they actually see something delivered? There's no point having repeated promises, repeated reviews, and saying that things will be sorted in the future. People have been waiting a long time and there are well-known problems on those routes. Why are they at the bottom of the priority list?
So the important thing is to recognise they're not at the bottom of the priority list, but they are. The actual appraisal process for the South West of Scotland has actually been one of the early actions that we've taken forward. It's ahead of a number of other local authority areas in identifying these areas where transport improvements need to be undertaken. So the member can be assured that it's, given what we have done today, is that there's a clear commitment to make sure we make those investments. Clearly, if we were to sign up to the plan to have a third route on the M8, there'd be less money available to invest in areas such as the A75 and A77. So if the priority is to look at putting in a third road on the M8, then that will provide less resource for areas such as the southwest of Scotland, which is why I don't think it's the appropriate priority for any transport infrastructure investment plan.
Graham, you've got a question.
Yeah, going back to trains. So I recently I took part. I wasn't the only committee member to take part in this online session on battery trains and the potential for them. And it was mentioned during that where you've got lines that are planned for electrification. And excuse me, convener, but this particular line was mentioned, the Glasgow to East Kilbride line. You're well aware of that. Where you've got things like bridges there, the use of battery trains can actually help. So I just wonder you know, what plans you've got to introduce battery trains in Scotland, and what potential you see for saving money where we're looking to improve the infrastructure.
Yeah. I think you raise a really good point, and you're right in terms of the East Kilbride line is one of the areas we've identified. I was there fairly recently. The investigation works have started there. It's not just electrifying that line, it's actually dualling the line as well, which will provide it with much greater resilience and capacity to help to support people making use of the services, and also enhancements to East Kilbride railway station, which in my view is just unacceptable in its present form, and that's why it's one of the early actions that we are intending to take forward. Can I say around there is in terms of propulsion types, so it's not just about electrification, and part of our decarbonisation of the rail network, it's not just about electrification, it's looking at alternative propulsions, including battery and also potentially hydrogen trains. The challenge here is where the technology is presently at. So one of the options that we do have, and we've been discussing and looking at, is that rather than electrifying, for example, all of the Fife Circle, is there a way in which you could actually electrify part of it, but operate battery trains on them that actually mean that you only have to have a section of it electrified to keep the batteries topped up, but the other sections could actually be completed by the train operating under battery power. And also that has the potential for some of our more rural routes, where actually introducing electrifying it in overhead lines, etc., in some rural areas brings additional risk, particularly during adverse weather. So having sections that are electrified but then operating it on battery are all of the areas that we are looking at, and also the potential for hydrogen trains and the role that they could play as well as that technology takes forward. So part of the work that I've directed officials to do is not for us just to look at having a decarbonisation plan which is about just electrifying the network. It is about doing that, but also looking to create the level of expertise in Scotland that allow us to develop battery trains and potentially hydrogen trains. And we're already in discussions with a number of manufacturers around the possibility of that. I've also engaged with Scottish Enterprise, who are now developing a rail cluster, and they've appointed a senior official to take forward this work, to look at trying to bring together some of the partners who could help to develop some of this technology and move it forward. We've identified an existing train that could potentially be adapted as a battery train. I think it's a 314?
Hydrogen is what's being looked at. Yes.
Hydrogen. So we've identified an existing ScotRail 314 train which could be adapted as a hydrogen train. There are some of our Hitachi trains that could have batteries installed as well. So I'm very keen, Mr Simpson, to make sure that our decarbonisation plan is not just simply about electrifying different routes, it's also about bringing in new technologies and to try and help to secure some of the design and development work around those new technologies here as well, so that we can try to get some of the wider economic benefits that come from that type of development work. And that's a big part of what I'm trying to drive forward with the decarbonisation plan.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. I'm glad you share my enthusiasm, and hopefully we can keep up a dialogue on that.
More than happy to, and I'm more than happy to discuss ADL issues with you as well as you.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks, Convener.
Okay, Cabinet Secretary, just looking around to see if there was any more questions. I've got a couple of quick ones. The Queensferry Crossing, you provided an updated snagging list, and I think on the snagging list, the latest one I had, there were 14 issues. I'm not proposing to go through all of them. It would be helpful, though, if you could update that list as far as the committee is concerned. But there are 4 that I picked out, and maybe you could just confirm that they've been done, or if they haven't been done, when they will be completed. So the tower maintenance access platforms, that was due to be completed in December. Is that done?
Well, to make it short, to help you, all the snagging work has been completed with the exception of a wooden fence on the southwest. All of the snagging work has been completed with the exception of a wooden fence that one of the contractors has got to install on a piece of land on the southwest of the land next to the bridge. So, yeah, just in terms of speed, it saves you can through a list if I say that they've all been completed.
That's perfect. The one thing that wasn't on that list that was discussed subsequently was the ice sensors. And as we approach winter, I wondered if you could just briefly update us on the position for ice sensors and preventing the build-up of ice on the cabling.
So the ice sensors have been installed. They were installed a couple of months ago. So that process has been complete. The purpose of the ice sensors is to give us early warning of ice build-up. The plan is still to manage it on an operational basis. Should an instant of ice build up again in the way in which we've had in a couple of occasions now, but the ice sensor work has now been installed, and the other work that was associated with that around enhanced weather forecasting to try and identify the circumstances when the risk increases has all been taken forward.
Okay, that's good news. And the final question is the Aberdeen Peripheral Road. You reached agreement. Now we'll be coming up to the post-year operation of it, which should be signalling the end of compensation claims. Are they in line with what you anticipated, and therefore will there be no real further expenditure on that above what was budgeted?
Yeah, from I think it was the 21st of February that I gave the committee an update, and that position remains the same. So,
okay.
So the settlement was agreed, and it's still at the level which I set out previously.
So are there compensation claims coming in?
Are there with ARL?
Well, under the compulsory purchase legislation and under the road building thing, the compensation, I believe, claims can be submitted for a period of time after the road opens.
I'm personally not directly aware of that, but then it wouldn't necessarily come to me. It would be a matter that would go through the legal process rather than it coming directly to ministers.
Okay, but the process is ongoing.
Now, you asking me about Aberdeen Roads Limited and the issue with them,
no,
or are you asking me about landowners?
I asked you two questions. First of all, was the question whether the process of completing the peripheral road compensation or the agreement with the contractor being done, and the second question was relating to compensation, relating to land purchase and land acquisition. After a period of land acquisition, there is a compensation claim period, which I can't remember from my training whether it's a year or 2 years that people have a time to submit claims. And I'm asking if that process is ongoing and working smoothly.
I can ask Alison Irvine to comment on that. She may be able to give you more detail.
So the two separate things. One's the contractual relationship
Yes.
with the contractor, and the other one is the land compensation associated with the land that we've had to buy compulsory. So that process is still ongoing because while that time period is there for people in which to make their claims for compensation, we can't necessarily force them to operate within that period. So it is ongoing. I am not aware of there being any particular issues associated with that.
Thank you. Okay. I don't see any other questions from committee members, so I'm going to thank you, Cabinet Secretary, you and your team, for coming in this morning. Considering the time, I am just going to ask you, if I may, to leave quietly while we move on to the next agenda item on our thing, which is a petition, agenda item 3, which is petition 01733. And this is the consideration of this, which was lodged on the 22nd of August 2020 by Peter Ritchie on behalf of the Scottish Food Coalition. The petition asks the Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to make the right to food part of Scots law. The Scottish Government has recently written about its intention to develop a non-statutory statement on the policy for food. The committee therefore is invited to consider whether it wishes to make any further action in relation to the petition. Now, before we consider this, I just wondered if anyone wants to say anything before we get into the actual petition. Christine, you want to say something?
Yes, I declare an interest because not only is Pete Ritchie a constituent, I know him very well, so I recluse myself from this.
Okay, thank you very much. John Finney, you wanted to say something?
Thank you. Are we discussing the options?
Yes, please. What the committee would like to do with the petition.
Indeed. Well, it would surprise you to know I'm very supportive of the petition's intention. I note where we are in relation to the Scottish Government's response. It's disappointing that the Good Food Nation Bill hasn't gone ahead. I would be very keen that we keep the petition open, Convener, so that we can monitor developments. And I wonder, for instance, we heard yesterday in the programme for government that the intention to enshrine the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child in Scots law. I wonder, for instance, if that would have any implications on where the Scottish Government sits in relation to this matter. So I'd be keen we keep it open and monitor developments, please.
Thank you, John. Colin, you'd like to say something on this?
Thank you, Convener. And I'd agree. I think it is important to keep this open. I mean, I think it's deeply disappointing that the Good Food Nations Bill was dropped. There's an irony that we're told it was dropped because of the pressure on parliamentary time as a result of COVID-19, when in fact, if ever an issue had become more important during that pandemic, it was issues around the right to food and food supplies and all the associated areas in the Good Food Nations Bill. So I think this is more important than ever before. It's worth pointing out that Elaine Smith is currently consulting on a members' bill on the right to food, so the issue is still very much live at the moment, and quite clearly it will be important for this committee to scrutinise the non-statutory commitment by the government to develop a statement on food policy. So I think it's important that we keep this petition live until those issues are fully resolved.
Thank you, Colin. Mike, you wanted to say something on that?
Yes, thank you, Convener. I support the whole issue of that a Good Food Nation Bill should be produced. We should have legislation for this. As I understand it, the bill was almost ready to be introduced in a matter of weeks until it was withdrawn simply because of the problems on legislative time. And the dissolution is in March. So we've only got 7 months and there's no prospect of legislation with the Good Food Nation Bill going through Parliament in that time. But I would advocate that we keep the petition open because it will be up for the next government, whichever government that is, to come forward with a Good Food Nation Bill in the next parliamentary session. And we can carry it forward to the next parliamentary session.
Oliver, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I'm broadly supportive of the approach. Other members have outlined the Good Food Nation Bill is important, but we don't have it, and I think, in fairness, now there isn't time to start that work. But these are important issues, and I think by keeping the petition open, we'll keep a focus on this issue and hopefully have a chance to come back to it.
Thank you. Emma Harper, followed by Maureen Watt.
Thank you, Convener. I agree with other colleagues in the approach to keep this open. I think it is really important that Pete Ritchie has brought this forward, and I also know Pete quite well as well. And I think we need to be keeping an eye on what the government is planning to do in relation to food and food supply chains and everything that's been highlighted during the coronavirus pandemic.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Convener Maureen.
Yes, just to echo what Emma said, and agree with what's been said by other members. The Cabinet Secretary has said that he's progressing some of the work that would have been in the Good Nation Bill anyway, and it's perhaps something that we could add to the question list when he's next in front of us.
Okay. No one else? For what it's worth, I'm not going to repeat what everyone else said, but I agree with committee members of the importance of this bill, this petition, and it seems to me that there is a general feeling amongst the committee that we should keep the petition open and that we should use the opportunities that we have with the Cabinet Secretary to raise the issue that are highlighted in the petition as and when those opportunity arises. So it appears that we're all agreed on that. I'm just looking around to make sure that we are agreed. We are agreed on that. So that's what we'll do in relation to that, and ask the clerks to note to take the opportunity to raise questions on this subject with the Cabinet Secretary when he comes in. Thank you very much. I know we're short of time because we have to go to the Chamber and other people have other meetings to go to. Thank committee members for their attendance today and the questions, and for their forbearance for allowing me to shorten some of the questions they had to allow us to complete the timescale that we had. Thank you very much, and I therefore close the meeting.